With paltry numbers of those inoculated in the country, government continues to vacillate about the reopening of schools. Perhaps of the two is a lesser evil, keeping schools which were breeding grounds of the second wave open, or keeping them closed and risking the learning of students and other attendant problems such as teenage pregnancies. To discuss this subject on Citizen Voices is the Public Relations Officer from the Education Ministry, Dennis Mujimba. And I'm your host, Emmanuel Mutaiziwa. Good evening. You're watching Citizen Voices, and our hashtag is Amplifying Citizen Voices. Mr. Mujimba, first and foremost, thank you for making time to come to this program. We've learned that recently the President had a meeting and has tasked the Premier and a team of technocrats at the Ministry of Health, at the Education Ministry, to come up with a blueprint on reopening schools. But we also heard that earlier on, the President was quite reluctant in regard to opening schools in October. Please, what is the latest in regard to this development?
Thank you, Emma, for inviting us as the Minister of Education and Sports. And viewers, thank you for tuning in. Now, when you talk of those UN statistics of the billions of learners that have been affected and are out of school because of the COVID pandemic, we are part of that story as a country. And right now, as we speak, a little over 15 million learners in this country are out of their education institutions because of the lockdown and closure of education institutions, apart from the health training and medical training institutions, which reopened on 13th of August, following the ease of the measures. Now, when we talk about this, sometimes the numbers cannot bring out the story very well. But within this as a sector, we've been affected. Now, we are not learners, but we are the facilitators of the learning process. As a ministry, we've lost colleagues. We've seen colleagues lose spouses. We've seen schools, some institutions lose their heads. We have seen the boards and some councils of these institutions lose their chairs, lose members. So we've been affected on a personal level. Now, we also are not working alone as a ministry or as government. We have the private players, private education providers. Now, those ones have also been hit in a unique way.
We'll come to that.
Yes.
Bit.
So with all this, it just shows you that the sector is facing a very unique and complex situation. So as the head of state was meeting the education sector with the National Task Force and the Minister of Health on Tuesday this week that we are ending, the issue was, what is the readiness state of the country to reopen? Now, it's not just the sector alone. The readiness.
It's a multi-sectoral approach.
It is a multi-sectoral approach, yes. Because unlike previous...
You must consult with the health ministry.
Yes, I mean, previously you could sit and decide...
The third wave is also at the foot, so you have to look at statistics and make a rational decision.
Yes, but you know, previously you could sit as the Minister of Education and decide, you know, we are going to open this term on this date. But not so. We are dealing with a very complex tapestry of conditions. So those other players have to come in handy. Now, it's not just the third wave. We are preparing as a sector that we need to learn to live with COVID. So the proposals we are coming up are not just for us to be seen through COVID, but in the event that COVID takes 2-3 years to go, how are we going to cope? And when His Excellency the President looked at the proposals, first of all, he was pleased that some of those measures, if implemented, they'll actually help in observing the SOPs, especially of social distancing. That is a very, very critical intervention in stemming this tide of COVID in these institutions. But the concern that came up after all this is now the lesson we learned from the before the second lockdown was that when students went back home, they took chaos to their households. Those are the boarding students. Now the question was, why is it that the chaos spiked after the boarding schools had closed? It shows that there was something happening in boarding institutions that the public did not know. Public includes the parents of these children or these learners. Now that was a big concern, because some of these, when they went back home, we saw parents dying. Now there is a local saying that in one of the languages that, what a coincidence that when my sheep has died, that is when your dog is passing fleece. Now, must be a relationship between these parents dying and these children going back home.
There's a correlation, definitely.
Exactly.
Yes.
So the president thought in his wisdom that, look, I hear Minister of Education, and not just Minister of Education, with all these stakeholders, because we met a day before with the Prime Minister chairing that meeting. The proposal was, let us reopen in October. But His Excellency said, I look at these statistics of the vaccination rates for the elderly. The numbers are not looking impressive. There are less than 13% vaccination rate out of estimated vulnerable groups. And these are people who are above 50 years of age. So I said, we need to do something there. We need also to ramp up vaccination for teachers. So go back to the drawing board and look at all these conditions that we've talked about. What is the most appropriate date that is going to give us leverage as government to have vaccinated a number of the elderly, raise that proportion?
And
yes, go ahead.
the numbers for the teachers
Yes.
are at about 200,000.
200 and
yes, out of 500,000, which is
550.
about 38%.
Exactly.
And yet you say you need slightly above 50?
Yes, we need over 50%.
Yes, so October doesn't make sense that you'll have vaccinated.
Now, by the way, those statistics that we saw, the 209,000 out of the 550 are not truly representative of the whole country. It's still a partial report because there has been high demand up country.
The 209, is it both two inoculations, or it's
no? It is now just one.
Wow,
yes, it's just one. And even one they can do.
It gives you some bits of
gives you a certain
preventive
level
safety net,
of protection.
Yes.
Better off than having nothing.
True.
So if these statistics from outside Kampala or the central region come in, from these local governments, the 177 that we have been ramping up vaccination for teachers and non-teaching staff, we actually hope that that number may leap much, much closer to 50%. Number two, Minister of Health, as you've been seeing in the media, they have received quite a number of consignments of vaccines. So all this, within 2 weeks, it is very possible to ramp up and hit 50% mark by October.
One will ask,
yes, please.
In the neighborhood, schools are open in Tanzania, schools are open in Kenya, schools are open in Rwanda. What is why is Uganda the exception to to the basic rule?
Yes, thank you, Emma. You know, that one has been a question. Why aren't we doing like our neighbors are doing? But I think that discussion has not been complete because someone has not been telling the public the full story. First of all, when you look at Rwanda, if you look at their vaccination rates for COVID-19, they have hit over 10%. That is just for the second dose. For the first dose, they are over 20% of the population, of the entire population of the country. Now, already, that already puts them at a different level of protection. Our neighbors, Kenya, if you look at the numbers, close to 3 million people have been vaccinated. Now, when you look at those statistics, compare it with ours, it helps explain a bit of why they are moving the way they are moving. Number two, I did contact some friends in those countries. And one of the things that is common in those countries and how they're handling the pandemic is that they are seeing a very strong surveillance system in these institutions. What does this mean? there is observance of the SOPs. There is reporting from these institutions into to the health, what we call the task force, COVID task forces in this country. Now, as opposed to what we learned in our country after the first lockdown, there was no good communication or feedback from the education institutions to the district task forces. And this is what I would like to call the conspiracy of silence. Now, pandemics and epidemics generally thrive when there is silence in the community that is affected. When we learned that in October, when we first reopened after the first lockdown, we had some cases. For example, there's one school in Kampala here, which I'll not name. They had over 60 cases of COVID in the institution. Mm-hmm. They raised an alarm to the Minister of Education. The Minister of Education mobilized the Minister of Health. We went and helped. There was no big deal in the media. We contained the situation. The same help also happened with the health training institutions. We had those flare ups already. As long as these institutions reported, we were able to handle. Now, come these other classes that were brought in a phased reopening manner, that is when the system broke down. The head teachers did not carry out the surveillance, the reporting. Because, Emma, unless you tell me that you're ailing, there's no way I'll dream about it.
Mr. Mujimba,
yes, sir.
Do schools have the capacity
yes.
to spontaneously test and be able to assess the level of how many kids, students have COVID? I don't think so.
Yeah, now, that is a very good dimension that you brought in. There is what we would like to call the layman's ability to surveil, to tell. For example, we know the common symptoms of COVID. It's a running nose, sneezing, headache, etc. The flu-like symptoms. Now, in this situation, when we are in the COVID pandemic, your first suspicion, if you see anyone with those symptoms, suspect COVID, before you even go for testing. So what we had trained these teachers as institutions to do is, once you see anyone, any learner having these symptoms, report. Then the health team will come in to do the test. We were not expecting the schools to do the testing themselves. And by the way, Emma, people have been asking, why can't you reopen and simply focus on testing? That question was asked, that proposal was brought to the ministry, and our Honorable Minister, the First Lady Janet Museveni, asked, okay, so who is going to meet the cost of the testing? And some people said it is the parent. Now, testing is not something you do once. So you'll find that within a term, the parent is going to spend over 200,000 shillings on testing for COVID. That is already a burden, and the government is not willing to impose a cost on the parents because of COVID-19. Already we have school dropouts because of high tuition fees. So you don't want to add another cost on parents. We also, she said, you go and consult with the Minister of Health. We consulted with and got qualified feedback from the Minister of Health that it is not sustainable to continuously test these learners. And the government itself has to be willing to bear that cost if at all such a decision is taken.
So in essence, October is unrealistic, going by the discussions.
Yes, according to the direction of the President, is that let us not look at October, let us use October to ramp up our vaccination and see how much we can vaccinate our elderly groups and vulnerable groups above the age of 50, and how much progress we can make on vaccination of teachers.
But as we speak now, the country recently received about 600,000 of doses from the US.
Okay.
But that's still quite a drop in the ocean. My question is, the US Centers for Diseases and Control and Prevention points out that school-going children are quite amplify the spread of this disease, and quite a number of the caseload in the US, I think about a third is as a result of school-going children. Our schools are congested. they don't have proper ventilation, they don't have all these amenities. Aren't we still facing the same situation? What has changed? Even when let's say even if we look at November.
Now, when you look at what we are facing, you have also to look at how long can you stay closed. Because looking at a scenario of COVID is likely to be here for 2 to 3 years. And if you do not have enough, because at the moment, the vaccine supply is not within our control until we begin manufacturing vaccines. So it is a trade-off between how long will you remain closed, waiting for vaccines, and what can you do with the little supplies that you have. And the wisdom of our leaders in government was that let us begin with the most vulnerable. So we began with the elderly and those people with comorbidities or pre-existing health and medical conditions coming down. Now, with that effort, if we can vaccinate the most vulnerable groups, of which the children under 12 or under 18 are not, except those that have pre-existing conditions, you will make some headway and open up. And that is why the president said, okay, let us focus on vaccinating teachers with the little that we have for the start, including the non-teaching staff. When you add those two categories, you're talking of close to 750,000 people. If you add on the tertiary institution students who are over 18 years of age, you're talking of about 310,000 people. So, in his wisdom, he said, if we can concentrate on that for the start, you will have increased, first of all, on the age group that you already want to vaccinate anyway. Then time will also be bringing us more vaccines that are appropriate for children. By the way, the science shows that even when these little ones get COVID, they do not get the severe forms, except if they have the pre-existing medical condition. So for the younger ones, it is not as bad. But you see, if you, the teacher, Emma, go there, and this young one puts you at risk, we stand much more to lose when we lose a teacher, we lose a professor. It takes a time, an eon to build a professor, and now you just lose a professor like that. Right. So that is why we want the people, our assets in these educational institutions to be protected. And that is why the focus is on that age group.
I will say that for every life matters. Even an ordinary folk, his life matters. But we're going to take a commercial break. You're watching Citizen Voices, and we'll be back. Welcome back. You're watching Citizen Voices, and our hashtag is Amplifying Citizen Voices. Our guest this evening is Dennis Mujimba, who is the spokesperson at the Ministry of Education. And we're discussing the subject of the schools reopening. Before we took a break, you talked about the fact that you plan to vaccinate a sizable number of teachers. But perhaps if we look at the science, that presupposes that the children won't spread the virus. And two, I read, I think one of a few articles, a long read in the Newsweek magazine about a month ago. And because of the, mutating phase of this virus, there was quite, I think, quite something based on, quite scientific evidence that suggests that there are certain types of strains, the beta strain that is quite common among school-going kids and really affects them and makes them quite ill. Perhaps shouldn't we be, looking at that kind of situation where we need to have mass vaccination of our school-going children beyond our teachers? Because as you're aware, Delta is a super spreader. And it's wreaking havoc in the West, in the US, in UK, where they have vaccinated over 50, in places where they have vaccinated over 50% of their population.
Now, what we also need to appreciate about the science of this pandemic is that there is a lot we continue to learn as we go through it. So what we knew at the beginning is so much little than what we currently know about it, how it spreads. Now, when it comes to the spread of COVID, the coronavirus, there is in science, let me call it the R0, or you can call it R0, which means that how many people that are not protected, they do not have an immunity towards certain disease-causing agent. How many people are infected if someone who has that virus, let's say, infect those people? Now, for the coronavirus, it is around 2 to 2.5 people. I'm saying this so that we appreciate, and our viewers appreciate, the issue of super spreading. For you to have a super spreader event, you need certain factors to work together to create that event. One of them, you need an infected person who is able to spread that virus. Number two, you need people around. The more people you have around, the more you'll create conditions for super spreading. So the environment matters. And number three, closed is worse than open. If you're in a closed environment, you're more likely to spread the virus among as many people than when you're in the open. So it comes back to the schools. Our schools are closed environments where the learners study from. Number two, there is, because of the government programs and opening up, liberalization of the education sector, you have huge enrollments in the lower levels, primary and secondary. Now, all this, if not well contained, is a combustion chamber to create a super spread event. So that is why when the president closed, by the way, the benefits of closing early from the first wave in March 2020, we are still reaping some of those benefits up to now. Number two, when we began opening, the minister proposed to the task force and before His Excellency the President that the sector will reopen in a phased manner. What does phased manner mean? It means you will not bring in all the classes at the same time. You begin with maybe P1 to P2 or P3 because they have had the least time of interaction. Even when you have reopened in a phased manner, she also proposed to bring in these classes to school in a staggered manner. What does this mean? If you reopen for senior 1 and 2, you can say that, okay, senior 1 study from Monday to Wednesday. You now have all the classrooms that would have otherwise been used by 6 levels. There you're observing social distancing. Then senior 2, study from Thursday to Saturday. So in the proposal, she's also including in expansion of the study week from Monday to Friday to Monday to Saturday. That will help now what we are calling the staggered manner. So we have phased, you bring in a few classes for maybe 8 or 10 weeks. Then even when they come, you also have staggered. They don't all have to attend the same days of the week. Number three, she also proposed something which she witnessed herself in the refugee camps in these refugee hosting districts. They are using what is called the shift system. Shift system means some learners or classes will study in a particular hours of the day. They go home and others come in the afternoon. Now, in some countries, that is part of the normal routine. But in Uganda, we've not been having it for the normal system. But in the refugee hosting communities, those schools have been using that system. So she has those 3 interventions she mentioned and proposed are game changers and helping in observing the SOP of social distancing. Now, when you solve the issue of social distancing, you will have reduced the risk of creating a super spreader event in these institutions. Even when we go to the higher education institutions, it is the same system. She's saying if universities, colleges, tertiary institutions, vocational and technical, if you're to come, you have to come in a phased manner. Laboratories, you have to have fewer learners in the laboratories. You have to have fewer learners in the workshops. So these are some of the interventions she's bringing and proposing, she has put on table. And she's saying if we observe these ones, we will reduce the risk of schools being super spreader events. However, even though these young people are not said to be, having the severe forms of COVID, they may be having a mild form, but they're able to transmit the virus.
Exactly.
So that is why we are saying, with the little vaccines we have as a country, and we really want these learners to go back to school, can we protect the giver of the first aid? Let me use an analogy of first aid, whereby you say that teaching is first aid, and the learner is the one you're administering first aid to. The person administering the first aid is the teacher, is the lecturer, is the professor, is the caregiver in the preschools. Now, there is a principle in first aid that before you administer first aid, you, the person giving first aid, you must be safe and protected. You don't put yourself in danger. Otherwise, you'll end up with two victims.
Exactly.
So that principle is what our public needs to appreciate, that we have to protect the first aid giver in the process of learning, who are the teaching staff, the non-teaching staff, the laboratory technicians, the bursars in these schools, that help this process of learning for the students when they return to school. So it is, we are saying that it is not that we think learners, as you rightly said, every life matters, but given the limited resources, and yet we want continuity of learning, what can we do with what we have? And as we get more vaccines that are approved for the young people who are 16 and below, I'm sure you'll see government vaccinating the learners. But at the moment, we do not have those ones. And if we have received, which main is Pfizer, it will be prioritized by the Ministry of Health.
I think it's Moderna which came in from the US.
Yeah, but Pfizer is the one that has been approved for the ones of
the
less than
learners.
16.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
So once that one has been brought into the country in sufficient stocks, I'm sure that Ministry of Health will give us clear guidelines on how to go about it. But even with that, the priority will first go to learners who have pre-existing medical conditions.
Yeah, that's true. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But to bring this debate forward, during this entire process, the lockdowns, a few times when the schools have been reopened, we know that learning is a universal right. We have since, been able to only give learning to those in the upper crust, and for the very obvious reasons. Internet access. I think statistics in 2018 showed that the access to the national electricity grid amongst the rural communities is only 8%. So if you don't have electricity, you can't power a tablet, you can't put on the computer and all these kind of things. How are you addressing that fault line, that you seem to only care for the learning interests of those in the upper crust, and you leave a majority of learners out of this process of learning?
Thank you for that, and the opportunity to respond and bring clarity to that concern that the public has been bringing across. In everything that the Ministry of Education has been putting across, there has not been anything to do with focusing on the haves in certain locations. In fact, our interventions have all been aiming at ensuring equitable access to continuity of learning. With this, government has invested over 76 billion shillings in providing home study materials. They started the first tranche, we had about 28.5 billion. We focused on the primary 5 to senior 4 classes because, one, those are the resources that we had, and that cohort of learners is much smaller compared with the majority that are in the lower classes. Then later on this year, through supplementary funding, we got 48.5 billion. Now, we focused on producing continuity of learning materials, home study materials, on P1 to P4, and then senior 5 and senior 6. Now, we have been distributing, and we are going to distribute these materials to all learners in public and private education institutions. That is, we shall be distributing them to the schools. Now, these ones of the 48.5 billion, we hope to begin distribution of these materials in the last week of September, first week of October. And the country was, because of the quantities of learners in this country, and to reduce on the liability of giving such a contract to one provider, the country was divided into 4 regions. There is a central region supplier called, I think it's MK Publishers, if I'm not mistaken. Then Western, there is New Vision. Then Northern, I think there is Riverflow International. I may have interchanged them, but at least I know New Vision is for Western. Then the East, the quotation was very high, so we had to re-advertise. So the distribution to the Eastern region is going to be a little delayed compared with the others. Now, all this is an attempt to ensure that even with the closure of schools, there is a measure of continuity of learning. I may want to explain to our viewers that these home study materials we are talking about are exactly extracted from the curriculum. And we are not going to give the learners 100% of the curriculum. Instead, we are focusing on what is core, what is most important. What is it that Emma, the learner, needs to know before moving to the next grade or next class? So we are not delivering the entire curriculum because of the conditions, we have less school time. The learners cannot be able to take by themselves at home through the entire curriculum or syllabus. So that is what the home study material is about.
Did you do any simulation
Yes.
to see the practicability of these learning materials? For instance, you're bringing these learning materials, there's no teacher in place. 2, the head of the household perhaps has been laid off from work, given the context of the COVID pandemic. In a rural setting, the young girls are doing chores and all these kind of things. What is the practicability of this?
Thank you. For the benefit of our viewers, I also happen to be a member of the National Curriculum Development Center Governing Council. So I'm really involved in the curriculum development processes for the primary and secondary levels of education here. When we were looking at this content for these home study materials, we designed them along the concept of homeschooling. And we learned this from the international schools we have around this country that are doing homeschooling already. So we listened and learned from those that have already done homeschooling and have been doing homeschooling, and brought such lessons into the design of the home study materials. They are designed to be used by the learner alone, not with the teacher.
When you benchmark international schools where kids have better cognitive skills, isn't that flawed?
By the way, it is not that learners in international schools have better cognitive skills. No.
For one reason, they have better attention skills, they have better, they have meals, they have all these things, they have the books and all these kind of things.
Yeah, by the way, not everything in international schools and their curricula is necessarily milk and honey. You have to be very careful on what you extract from there. Some of the things they have, you may not want to bring them into your culture as a society. So you have to be very careful. But in terms of methodology of delivery of learning, using the home study materials, we had to learn because we have a system here which was not used at all, had never even designed curricula that is meant for home study. So we had to do a lot of learning within a short time to design materials that you, Emma, who is 13 years old, if we gave you this material, you can learn by yourself at home with minimal supervision by an adult. Now, this, by the way, is also something that we integrated in the design of the O-level curriculum when we revised it. You will see, get an opportunity and see these materials, the textbooks we have used for this lower secondary curriculum. We also designed those textbooks to be used by the learner with very minimum supervision by a teacher. And this was the guidance we got from our political leader, saying that can we make the learning experience more enjoyable for the learner, make it learner-centered, whereby you can navigate through learning and you only have a teacher or one adult by you to simply facilitate learning. So we had already prepared such things, though not at the scale of a pandemic. So I was still continuing with continuity of learning. We also have supplementary lessons delivered through radio stations. And on this, government has invested 600 million shillings to deliver lessons, not for all subjects, through about 16 radio stations around the country, which have a certain listenership that we believe can touch majority of learners. However, the challenge we are noticing is that why we need to reopen and give learners an opportunity to have face-to-face interface with schools is the very challenges you've mentioned. Adults are not in the home always. They have to go and fend for their families. Number two, you do not have, even if you said all TV stations, all radio stations, stop your normal programming, we are going to focus on delivering lessons for our learners. You don't have that time. The 24 hours are not enough. So we need to make sure that we have a window of bringing back learners to school so that these other interventions of home study, materials, and radio lessons simply supplement or complement the in-person attendance. Because in this country, the level of internet access does not allow you to distribute all these materials through the internet. Also the cost. And our minister has really been at the forefront of this, saying that whatever intervention we come up with as a sector, we must be mindful, one, of the majority learners, what is their profile. Number two, we must be mindful of equitable access, meaning you have to be mindful of the vulnerable person. Are they going to access the intervention you have delivered? Now, those are anything we are designing as a sector for continuity of learning has to address that. And key among them is once we get a window for reopening, let us cover a certain magnitude of the curriculum. Then when learners are going back home, we shall give them enough study materials to take them through the period when they are studying from home before they come for a second shift. Then for the higher education institutions, there is a drive for, of course, online learning. However, the minister has also said, by the you people, we also have vulnerable people in the higher education institutions. True. And she has pushed back and said, before you push for the agenda of distributing tablets and computers to learners in higher education institutions, also be mindful of where they are coming from. Do they have the electricity you're talking about to charge those gadgets? So in everything she's saying, whatever we think of as a sector, we must think of the masses. Don't focus on the elites alone. Even here, by the way, in Kampala, we are talking, Kampala, geographically it is urban, but we have pockets of poverty. You may be having electricity in your home, but next door there's someone who doesn't have electricity. So if you give me, you give Dennis this laptop, where will I charge it from? So some of the things that are being looked at is, if you go digital, you must go digital with provisions for offline capabilities. Offline meaning the learner does not have to sit on the laptop and internet access all the time to have learning. Now on that one, there are some advanced preparations and arrangements where the minister has said that we need to have a fallback position as government, an online platform for all our education institutions to deliver learning online. And it's going to be, let me use the word
do you have guidelines for this? Because it seems it's a little bit patchy. Every institution comes up with its own set of policies. You see one doing an online exam and the other guy is doing something else.
Now for the higher education institutions, they've had their own online platforms using guidelines that were developed by the National Council of Higher Education. So the guidelines are there. And this alternative that the minister said we need to have as government as a fallback position, it is meeting all the requirements of the National Council of Higher Education. Now, it is not going to take over what is already in place. If Makerere or Uganda Christian University, you've already been having your own platform, continue with it. But if you think maybe of Mountains of the Moon University that is coming on board, if you think of Cavalry University, think of IUIU, if you don't have this capability, we'll be saying here's a platform. You'll be able to upload all the textbooks that you need. You'll be able to put all the lessons that you need. You can even conduct assessment on that platform. Now, you can do it live, or the learner can get in and actually download content and work on offline. And after, when they get time of getting on the network, they can upload all that they have done. Now, that is something that the minister has really spent time thinking through and getting key stakeholders to help her think through it. And we believe that this capability is going to give us leverage, not just in the short term, but also in the long term, because these platforms are going to be there for a long time, with or without COVID. Thank you.
At one time, you came up with this much vaunted radio program, and I think in our budgets there was that item where billions of shillings were, you know, set aside to purchase radios. How far did this go, and where is it as we speak?
Thank you. That is also an issue that came up in the meeting with His Excellency the President on Tuesday. And what happened is that the 10th Parliament, all such fundings, and it was a lot of money that required a supplementary budget. So it was taken before Parliament as the normal procedure. So the members of Parliament of the 10th Parliament looked through and did not approve it. So we did not make any headway with it. Okay. So it is not an option we are working with right now. We are looking at other options for continuity of learning. However, even though those radios were to come, the reality is that the time that is required to deliver significant and meaningful curricular content, we don't have that enough time or airtime on the available radio stations. Then you also have a challenge that even with over 300 radio stations we have in this country, one, the cost, but also the coverage. Not every household is within the coverage of a radio station that you're using. So there are also limitations with these radio programs. Now, third is that in countries where radio delivery of learning has taken place, they have a way of where the delivery gets feedback. You're delivering on lesson, but learners are able to call back, and you get to know what is the progress of these learners. You're not delivering in darkness. Now, that is not something that we are at the level at. It is a one-way communication right now. If I get on air and I'm delivering about a certain topic in English, I'm just talking and hoping that the learners at the other end are getting me. Now, the issue of assessment, how do you know that the learner is actually learning? And the government is also looking at that. Very soon we are going to be piloting an intervention where you can assess whether the learner that is on the other end, whom you're not even seeing, but you hope he or she is there, is he actually following you? We are going to pilot it amongst 1 million learners in both public and private schools. We were delayed because of the lockdown measures, but we want to test it in an environment where learners are at home. So even if we reopen, whenever we reopen, and I think it will be soon, is that pilot will tell us a lot on the effectiveness of continuity of learning using home study materials, but also using radio programming to deliver lessons.
One of the biggest problems that we're currently grappling with across the country, if you move south, north, east, west, is the scourge of teenage pregnancies. Many of our girls who are no longer going to school are very vulnerable in these communities. What are you doing about this problem?
Well, that's one of the social issues that has been amplified by the closure of these institutions of learning is teenage pregnancies. Now, I'd like to assure our viewers that even before this pandemic hit, the ministry had been developing what we call re-entry guidelines, whereby if a learner became pregnant in school, can you go home after you've given birth? Can you return and continue from where you stopped? And these guidelines, the minister signed them off in September 2020, but we spent more than a year developing them. This was even pre-COVID. Now, our heads of institutions need to know that these guidelines are available. When a learner becomes pregnant, they should not be chased away from school.
Yeah, we've seen that in institutions of higher learning.
Exactly. They should not be chased.
Exactly.
Okay? Number two, by the way, even where in the...
It's like punishing the victim
yes,
twice.
you should not. You should not. I mean, there are some things, because this is not a criminal offense.
Actually, the girls are vulnerable. So
yes. And when she was signing off this was in response to that, to show people that you can give people a second chance. Some of them became pregnant not because of their own making. It was out of violence. In the home, but also in the education institution, or on the way to the education institution of learning. So these guidelines are there to bridge that gap, that please give support to this girl who has become pregnant. Let them have an opportunity to continue on with their life after they've given birth. In the 1.1 million learners results the minister released last month for PLE Senior 4 and Senior 6, there were learners who actually came to sit exams that were pregnant. Now, previously, all those learners would not have been allowed to sit exams. But she said, no, let these people come. Now, even though they come, it does not mean that the government is condoning teenage pregnancy in schools. No. It is saying, let us give every citizen an opportunity, a second chance, irrespective of the circumstances that they've gone through. Whether by their making or not their making, let us be a redeeming sector. Let us create hope for these young people. So when your young daughter has become pregnant, the primary responsibility is with you and me as parents to give psychological and psychosocial support to this young person, to tell them that there is an opportunity, carry on the pregnancy, give birth safely, come back to school, continue with your studies. It is possible. We have testimonies of many young people who have come back to school from secondary. Some of them are now university graduates with the issue that happened to them in Senior 1 or Senior 2. So the parents, the community, and the school institution, because, Emma, what we also realized is that when this young girl returns to school, she gets stigmatized. So this is something we have to do together. It is not just government. Government may put in place the guidelines, but it's not government implementing the guidelines. The guidelines have to be implemented by you, the parent, have to be implemented by you, the learner, because however much your parent shows interest in having you continue, you, the learner, has to have interest to continue. Now, when you come to school, the school has to give you a conducive environment. Do not stigmatize these people when they have returned. Let them have a life.
It's been quite a long span of time that there's a lot of despondency amongst the teachers, the community of teachers. Many of them no longer have that, small little salary that they used to earn and eke a living. Many of them don't have alternative sources of livelihood. And we've seen stories of some becoming vendors and taking up all sorts of things to be able to survive. I know you've tried to put in a bit of money in the circles, but is this a category of people that the government has prioritized? Because if without the good teachers, when people now start thinking of leaving the teaching profession, then you'll not have good results in the learning process.
Yeah. Emma, the issue of teachers and private education service providers, how they've been hit by COVID, it is an issue that you really have to be compassionate for you to understand what they are going through. Right from the start, even after during the first lockdown, the minister and her political team, and on behalf of government, began interacting with especially the owners of private schools and institutions, the teachers, because their plight was already viewed at that time that these people are going to be hit hard. Whichever way COVID ends, but they are going to be hit hard. Why? Their primary source of revenue is tuition fees in these schools. So when you've closed schools, there is no source of income. Now, some of them had a buffer of savings, but this was wiped out within 6 months. Some of them continued paying a salary to these teachers and the non-teaching staff, but it was not sustainable. It was wiped out within about 6 months. So, as you rightly said, when the plight was brought to the attention of His Excellency the President, he thought of what government can do given the other demands. And that is how the 20 billion plus assistance came through. Now, the philosophy of this fund, let us call it a seed fund, that government has given the private school teachers, is for it to be revolving amongst their circles. Circles, plural, not a circle. Now, what did we do as Minister of Education and Sports? Minister of Education and Sports, we found that these teachers did not have a common platform. They had their standalone associations or structures, and even some circles were in place, but they did not have a common umbrella body which could talk with government. So the ministry facilitated the establishment of that platform called the National Private School Teachers Association, what we abbreviate as NAPSTA. Now, NAPSTA is a well-established entity. We even got advice from the Attorney General. We involved the private school teachers right from the districts through an electoral process up to the national level to come up with their leaders. Now, they decided themselves, not even Minister of Education, that now they do not have the competences to manage the funds. They will need a fund manager. They decided on the microfinance center. Now, government will provide the resources to the microfinance center. This entity called NAPSTA will work with microfinance center and agree on the operational detail of availing that resource as a revolving fund to the private school teachers. It looks like little money when you begin saying how much that each private school teacher gets. But that is not the design intent of that fund. It is supposed to be taken in maybe a form of credit and revolving within the circles. So when that is done and run well, hopefully by the voices of the beneficiaries through NAPSTA, that will happen. Now, when we facilitated the process of establishing that platform called NAPSTA, as the Minister of Education, we have absolutely nothing else to do with that money. However, now the challenge, Emma, we are getting is that, you know, when your daughter gets of age and wants to get married, you begin seeing relatives that never showed up before, and they're all claiming a stake on this young girl of yours. You'll see the aunties you never knew, uncles, all of them want a stake. Now, this is what we are right now seeing. Everyone is saying NAPSTA cannot represent us, etc. But it went through a legal process to establish it. Unfortunately, if these private school teachers continue grumbling amongst themselves, I can tell you that money over 20 billion is going to sit there for the next 5 years and not being utilized. And I can tell you, and our minister has been very clear, the First Lady introduced NAPSTA to the Minister of Finance. NAPSTA was also introduced to the Microfinance Center, saying these are the people that are going to represent the private school teachers. Work with them. Minister of Education, we are out of it. So the ball is now in their courts. It may look like a small step to give them over 20 billion, but government is hard-pressed on other things. Remember, we still have to vaccinate over 20 million people. We still have to jumpstart other sectors of the economy. It is not just about education. You also have health. You have to put oxygen, enough oxygen supply in these health institutions. You have to continue with learning by providing home study materials. You have to do all this. So government has to make sure that it juggles so many balls, making sure none of the ball lands down. So with that, we can only intervene in the way we can, in a small way. Of course, the private schools have been saying, one time there was a proposal that can government give them some 2.5 trillion to bail them out.
The administrators.
Yes, but you know, 2.5 trillion is almost the entire health sector budget. Now it is desirable, as our minister is always saying, but it is not feasible. There are some good things we want to do as a ministry for our stakeholders and our partners, but we cannot afford them. And the government cannot borrow 2.5 trillion on top of the debt we already have to do all this. So it is sometimes you find yourself, Emma, in a situation where the worst choice or decision is the only option you have. And that option is you just cannot bail them out the way you would. And we know.
But has there been any support to private school administrators? We've seen support go to businessmen who are cherry-picked, and businessmen you'd expect are not within the category of the most vulnerable. UDB gave out money, and there were questions in that regard. Why didn't we think about the folks who have spent lots of money to invest, put up good structures, get good teachers to teach learners?
Now, government does appreciate the contribution of the private education service providers. They really play a big part. They are integral in successful delivery of learning in this country. When all these negotiations were going on, our minister took this group of people to the president, and they laid down their plight. And I am not well versed with how far it has gone, but one of the requests they had put was for them to be included in the support that was coming through UDB. However, one of the things we need to appreciate is that the funding that went into UDB did not necessarily come from our taxpayers' money. Majority of that funding came from foreign support.
Is that the ADB loan?
No, UDB.
No, I mean from African, because I remember there was a loan request prior to COVID from, I think, the African Development Bank that UDB had asked for, and I don't know what then happened.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, but there was, the IMF also put in money. So usually when some of these negotiations are made, at that time you have to stick to what you negotiated at the beginning. And some of these, they were what they call the production sectors. There was agriculture, there was, all those were in there. Now at that point, I am not sure whether education had been part of it. Now trying to change the rules in the middle of the game is very difficult, because you end up with what sometimes we've seen, democratization of resources, where you want everyone to get a little bit. And when you want everyone to get a little bit of something, you end up with everyone getting insufficient amounts of anything, and what you have gotten cannot even take you anywhere. So that it's not like it was 2.5 trillion or low, like what they were asking for. But I think we get the principle that they wanted support from government. And by the way, they are not the only ones that were asking for support. Because when you look at the ecosystem of the education sector, you are also having owners of hostels. They are purely private. Now, it's not a part of the education institution, it's purely private. But they also took credit to put up these hostels. Now you close schools, there are no learners who are the tenants that were paying rent. So they were also asking for bailout from government. So there is a whole, when you look at the education system, the ecosystem alone, there is a lot that if you're to bail out, where do you begin from, where do you end? And if government was a person, sometimes you have to feel sorry for government because you have little, but the mouths or the hands demanding are just so vast. So strategy is about saying no to certain good things, not to the bad ones. Sometimes the bad ones are so obvious. But I think as government, you have to decide and say, given the little that we have, let us focus on this. Because when you focus on agriculture, when you focus on bailing out industry, you'll be able to generate taxes. And these taxes will be able to pay what we call capitation grants for the over 7 million learners or 10 million learners that government is paying capitation grants from. But if you borrow, now this is just a scenario, if you borrow 2.5 trillion, give it to the private providers. Now you've given it to private providers and you're hoping to repay, but this is not going to be repaid immediately. It will be repaid by your grandchildren. But if you put this money within the agriculture sector, within about 6 months, you'll begin collecting revenue. If you put it in the construction sector, you'll begin collecting revenue in terms of taxes. So I think those are some strategic choices government has to put. And when government makes those choices, it does not mean it is not mindful of the others it has not catered for. But it is an issue of you have little, you have a lot of demand, but you cannot democratize bailout.
And I agree with you entirely that one, we may not have so much, our resource envelope is limited. And I also agree with you that the priority is to invest in productive sectors of the economy. But I think a week ago, our investigative desk ran a story which shows that government spends nearly 1 trillion shillings buying its politicians, its VIPs, its highest paid civil servants. Plus, you know, these nice, very nice vehicles. At a time of this kind of monumental crisis, isn't that one of the areas that you would plow back money and help the most vulnerable? Why should you buy the highest paid civil servant a vehicle, and yet you could perhaps give him an interest-free loan and he purchases this vehicle? Shouldn't we have a rethink of such kind of things if we really show that we care about the underclass in this country?
I think that question is best responded to by people in the Ministry of National Guidance and ICT, because they are where they sit and the information they get, they're in a better position to understand what does government look through to say, let us go with this, let us turn down this. But for us as education sector, we also know that we've been procuring vehicles. But when we do that, for example, we want to procure vehicles to strengthen our inspection of schools. Now, we really need to do this, especially in the reopening of schools, preparing them. If you reopen and you're not able to supervise to ensure that these schools are meeting the SOPs, you'll be in trouble. We don't want to be desk or wheel or chair supervisors. We want to go and supervise, inspect, monitor to ensure that these SOPs are being adhered to. When learners go back, they'll be safe. Now we need vehicles to do that.
You're right.
Yes.
Perhaps you're right. And I'm not talking about that category. Seychelles, which has a GDP capita of about, I think, $12,000, has a speaker and deputy speaker who drive in a Toyota Raum. What is that we so much do to try and, you know, I think, are we trying to flaunt that we're such, you know, a rich country? What I'm talking about is our highest paid civil servants. If they want to drive the expensive cars, why can't they pay for that from their pockets? How come we don't give that money to surgeons. We don't give vehicles to surgeons, for instance, who play a very important role in this country and save lives.
All right. Two ways to respond to that. One, I think it would be good to interact with the experts from the Ministry of Public Service to expound on how they determine what benefits certain categories of civil servants get. So I think they are better positioned to do that. Number two, what I know as a sector, and I'll talk because I see what we see what our political leader, the First Lady, has said, who is the Minister of Education and Sports, to reduce on any expenditure that is luxurious, in line with what the government decisions have been by Minister of Finance. So that is what we are doing to contribute to making sure that the little we have is focused on continuity of learning in this period. Leave out the luxury, focus on completing the projects that we began, focus on strengthening inspection, focus on ensuring that the teacher training institutions have means of transport to monitor and coordinate the teachers when they are doing teaching practices, etc. Those are the things she's focusing on. She has rejected requests for new vehicles in her ministry.
That's good.
She has refused that. So that is what I know.
That's exemplary.
That is what I know that she has done in the sector. What others are doing, I think another person will respond.
Yeah. As we come towards the end of this program, one of the last questions I have is, when learning resumes,
yes,
do you think this is an opportunity for us to rethink and perhaps overhaul this, old school curriculum? For instance, I'll quote Elon Musk. He says, higher institutions are places for holiday because we churn out many graduates. They come out and we don't see, the good bridges and all these practical things. And the information age and artificial intelligence and technology and all these changes have kind of changed the outlook that we no longer have, brick and mortar companies at the top of the New York stock exchange, but more or less of ICT. Yes. Elon Musk says, the owner of Tesla says, he's better off hiring someone with coding skills than a university graduate. Are we going to now fully integrate ICT and try to be much more practical and perhaps look at a curriculum overhaul?
Emma, what is amazing, and as I told you, I work closely with the National Curriculum Development Center. Ever since 2016, when the current political head of the ministry joined, she really immersed herself in ensuring that we change our curriculum in this country. Now, when I look at the proposal she was making then and what we are doing with our curriculum to fit in the COVID era, you can actually see she was living in the future. But at that time, we were never seeing COVID on the horizon. One of the things she emphasized was we have to skim down on the content. There was too much fat, excess fat. Now, in the era of COVID, we are now looking at focusing on the core content. For example, in P1 to P3, when we reopen, we are going to be focusing on literacy, numeracy, and English language, because those are the foundations of learning. Now, that principle of focusing on the core is cutting through the entire system. Number two, she was emphasizing, when we were revising the O-level curriculum, that we have to make sure the syllabus and learning we design is learner-centered, whereby you have an adult as a facilitator of learning, not the center and source of all knowledge. That was the spirit within which she gave guidance on a review of the lower secondary curriculum. Now, those principles are holding so true in this era of COVID. Now, in the plans that we had as a National Curriculum Development Center was to embark on reviewing the A-level curriculum. We are going to do the same. I entirely agree with you. This is an opportunity for us to change things for good and for the better. And I think this has been a training ground for us as a sector to know which areas do we need to maintain the momentum of change for the good and which ones have we been not doing well on.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dennis Mujimba, the Public Relations Officer, Minister of Education. We've been discussing the subject of the schools reopening. You've been watching Citizen Voices, and I'm your host, Emmanuel Mutaiziwa. Have a pleasant evening.